In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified.
Wonderful, thank you. A wonderful life. Is that how you describe your life? It's a wonderful life. The movie, and again for those who haven't seen it, a little bit of an overview. Set in 1945 in Bedford Falls in America, the central character is George Bailey. And the outworkings of the movie and the start of the movie take place at Christmas, on Christmas Eve. And it's very moving at the beginning because you hear all these prayers that are rising up to God and being heard in heaven. Prayers from his family and his friends. You realise that George is in crisis. I love one prayer in particular, bring Daddy back. I find that very moving each time I see the movie. As a boy, we learn that George saved his brother from death. Again, one of the early scenes, you see them sliding down this icy bank on these sledges and going over this frozen water. And his brother Harry goes through the ice, and George, very sacrificial by character, jumps in at risk to himself and saves his brother. But as a result, he loses hearing in one of his ears, and that stays with him forever. We see another early scene when he was a boy, when a chemist, we don't know why at first, but he's very, very troubled. We learn that his son has been killed, and he's just heard this news. And in his distress, the chemist is about to put the wrong pills, the wrong prescription into a bottle, and it would have killed the boy for whom the medicine was intended. And George again steps out, sacrificed to himself, because he gets a clip round the ear for suggesting to the pharmacist, to the chemist, that he's doing something wrong, but through his actions saves the life of a boy. As a young boy, I love this enthusiasm for life. This vibrant boy wants to see the world, wants adventure, wants the fullness of life, really wants a wonderful life. Then we see George as a young adult, and things aren't quite turning out how he thought. He ends up working for his father in his father's loan business, and it's quite a mundane job, quite a job of grind and not much excitement, not much fun, but it's really key because it's in what's called a loans company. And during this time in America where there was a lot of poverty, people who didn't have money would borrow money from people who didn't have a lot more, but they would club together and kind of help each other out. So it would help people being able to find food, pay for rent, that kind of thing. So absolutely crucial work in this town that George was part of, working with his dad. But he didn't want to do it forever. He wanted to go off for college for more excitement, to taste some of what he thought life was all about. But his father has a stroke and dies. And the only way this crucial loan company can continue is if George takes over. Again, more sacrifice is called for. And the money he has been scrimping and saving, because he's not wealthy, to go to college, he actually gives to his brother, so his brother can go to college in his place for 4 years, hoping, brother Harry, when you return, please can then you take over the family business and I can go off to college. Trouble is, after 4 years, Harry comes back full of the joys on the train, steps off the train, as does his bride. He comes back married, and he comes back with a job offer out of town, a long way away from his father-in-law. George's plans are going down the pan again. But he stays, because if he doesn't, the loan company will shut and people will suffer. So he cancels his plans to travel and see the world, and he stays in this little old town of Bedford Falls. Then he meets Mary, they marry, and they're about to go on their honeymoon, but there is a financial crisis in America. There's a rush on the banks, and if the bank runs out of money, this loan company will close, and again people will suffer. So what do Mary and George do with their $2,000 that they had saved to go and travel abroad for their honeymoon? They start handing it out to people as they come into the bank so the company doesn't have to close. More sacrifice. They settle down in this life which is very different to that which he had hoped for, in their marriage, having more and more children. And at this time, there's this kind of battle between good and evil going on, with the evil Mr. Potter, who is very wealthy. He runs the town, he runs the banks. He wants this loan company because it's the one area that he doesn't have. He makes his money out of people living in slums and paying him rent. Good versus evil. And then one day the crisis happens that sends George over the edge. The auditors are coming in, we know what that feels like, and checking all the books. And everything should be fine, but his uncle, who he works with also, and I think at the time, they don't say it, but he's showing signs of dementia, very forgetful. He mislays $8,000. Actually, Mr. Potter sees him do it and he covers it up in his evil deeds. But because of that crisis, and if that happens, then George fears he will end up in prison. Everything will fall apart. And this good man actually loses it. And he, enraged, in anger, shouts at everybody. The uncle, the poor children, he shouts at as they're preparing for Christmas and playing pianos and that kind of thing. His wife, he just loses it. He rushes to the bar, drinks more and more and more, then rushes to this bridge over these icy waters. And he wants to jump in. But the prayers of his family, the prayers of the town people who care for him are heard. And also his prayers of desperation are heard. And somebody, and I love this name, an angel called Clarence. Not only is the angel called Clarence, he's called Clarence Oddbody. And that says everything about Clarence because, as we're told, he's a second-class angel. He doesn't add up to much. And he's very humble in his appearance, very basic, doesn't even have his wings. If he carries this out, hopefully he will earn his wings. But he comes, this second-class angel, and he's wondering about how he can save George from jumping in the water. And he knows how kind and sacrificial George is. So the angel jumps in the water, knowing that George will save him. And he does. And you see them going to the riverbank. You see them then talking afterwards. And George, who's this angel? You don't look like an angel. Well, yeah, actually, if you are my guardian angel, that's exactly the kind of angel I would have, a second-class angel. George says to Clarence and to God, I wish I'd never been born. And he means it. But it gives Clarence an idea. I'm going to grant that wish through the power of God and show you what life would be like in this town if you hadn't been born, if you hadn't made all the difference that you have actually made but you don't realise. So they go back to the town, which is no longer called Bedford Falls, it's called Pottersville. Mr. Potter has got his way. He keeps bumping into people who don't recognise him. He recognises in the town that it is a town without hope. It has become very, very seedy. And without his good influence, Potter and others have brought out the worst in people. It's a very mean town. He also finds out that chemist has been in prison for 20 years because George wasn't there to stop him from killing inadvertently that child. He also goes to where all these new homes had been that his loan company had helped finance. And they're no longer there. People are living in slums, and in place of those new homes is a cemetery. He sees the tombstone of his younger brother Harry. He hadn't been there to save him when he went through the ice, so Harry died. And he learns not only that, because this war hero Harry had saved hundreds of troops who were going to be hit by a plane. But they're all dead because Harry wasn't there, because George hadn't been there for Harry. Thankfully, very Hollywood, thankfully there's a very happy ending to all of this. There are some fantastic themes throughout the film that are so relevant for this season, for Advent, that season of waiting. Because in the film, I remembered Advent, it was in the darkest moment for George, in that crisis, after a lot of waiting, that the light eventually breaks in through Clarence Oddbody. And what about Clarence? Well, in many ways, he's a very Christ-like figure in the movie, because he comes like Christ came, like Jesus came, not as this, whoa, but in weakness, in humility. Remember, we hear in Hebrews and in the Psalms that Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. In Philippians 2, we hear about how he humbled himself and came as a person, letting go of that which he could rightly hold on to. How else can we see the good news in this film? I wonder how you who've seen it have seen the good news, the overlap. If only we have eyes to see, we can see the good news of Jesus Christ in so many things that we would normally say, oh, that's secular. But how else? These are a few ways that I saw the good news. With Romans 8 in mind, we had our reading earlier, 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. The film's a reminder that whether we know it or not, God is involved in every aspect of our lives, in every way. Those who profess to be Christians and those who don't. And it's not about a God who micromanages everything, as though we're puppets pulling our strings, because that would be robotic and not relational, not lifelike. It's much more than that. God working in us, with us, and, believe it or not, through us as well. There's a real clue to when God is working through somebody. Again, whatever faith they have, or people of no faith. If they're loving, who's that working in them? Where does all love come from? God is love. That's a real clue that God is working in and through somebody, through their words of love, their acts of love, their being with somebody and not saying anything, but being with in love. We can make a difference like George. We might not realise we're making a difference, like George didn't, until his eyes were opened up to what the town would look like without George Bailey. And like George, we might have to wait and see. I don't know if you can relate to this, but many things we do, we might not see the good outcome, the ripple effect. Do an act of kindness, do something loving, and there will be a ripple effect. But we often have to wait. We might have to wait ultimately to when we look back with the Lord one day at our lives to see, okay, yes, that little simple thing made a big difference. I can really, really, really relate to this. As a minister, many of you know, a little bit like George, I wanted a real adventure as a minister. I wanted to make a big difference like George. I could really relate to his phrase, I want to do something big, something important, George said. I want to build skyscrapers. And he ends up, because of his poor hearing, being an air warden when all his friends go off and do supposedly more glamorous things and win medals and all that kind of thing in different parts of the world. But I wanted to make a massive difference as a minister. Lead a big church. Yes, go to the States. I don't know why, but I wanted to go to the States. I wanted to write books. And look at me now, 12 years on, in the same church. A little church. Haven't written a book yet. But God has done something in me. I've been learning to trust that actually it's in the little things, not the grand things. I don't want those things anymore. I could really relate to George, but it is in faith, in trust. Many jobs and being a minister, you can't see the impact of what you do for good or ill. It's not like those buildings that were being built in the film, where you're a builder, you're a bricklayer, you're a roofer, and you can see the end product. We can't see any end products. You have to trust by faith that the little we do, God will magnify and do something through. But we have to wait and see, and ultimately it might be when we look back with Jesus. How about you? Are you aware of the impact of the good you do already? I'm assuming. Or the impact of the good you could do even more. Not in grand things necessarily, but in the day-to-day. Acts of kindness, humility, generosity. Giving somebody a chance to speak rather than speaking over them. Simple stuff, but really hard. Small acts of kindness, little things, are what makes the kingdom grow. Thy kingdom come. Just do it, Lord. Actually, no. God does it through us. God doesn't do it all on his own. He doesn't want to. There's a lovely part towards the end of the film where this missing money, God doesn't just miraculously make it appear. But all these people who love George in the town, they gather up all their pennies and their notes, or their dimes and their dollars, and they make up the missed money. God is working for the good, but in and through people. Thy kingdom come, but through people more and more. The next part that came to mind from Romans 8:26. In the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness, we do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. Prayer is important. Prayer and actions, don't just pray, act as well, but prayer is key. Prayer makes a difference. And again, we see this in the film through the prayers of George's friends and family. But there is a real mystery to prayer, isn't there? There's a lovely part in the film, again, where George, in his desperation, goes to the bar, gets drunk, and if you're there, he doesn't really believe, but he does. If you're there, please help me, God. That prayer of desperation. But what happens as soon as he utters that prayer? The husband of a teacher he has just been rude to recognises him and comes and smashes him on the nose. Is that God's answer to prayer? We're often like that, I think. We pray, something bad happens. Why has God done that? Well, actually, God has not done that. But again, we have to wait to see how God does act in and through other people. I have had many prayers of desperation. I don't know if you have. One of my earliest prayers, long before I was a Christian, was a prayer of desperation to a God I did not believe in. if you are there kind of God. And sadly, God didn't answer that prayer when we had that massive mortgage in our flat in Crawley and I'd lost my job and all that kind of stuff. It took ages, seemingly, for God to answer that prayer. But things started to unfold and God started, I believe, to weave things together. And I have had more of those prayers of desperation, learning actually to trust that God does move in mysterious ways and not always seemingly anyway, immediately. And doesn't answer prayers in the way that we would always like. Often God seems absent. Have you noticed? Often it seems like our prayers hit the ceiling. Have you noticed? Learning to trust in our waiting that God hasn't actually abandoned us. How about you? Can you relate to desperation? Can you relate to the frustrations and the beauty of the mystery of prayer? Thirdly, and finally, I feel like a real Spurgeon's minister this morning. They used to say 3-point sermons, but here we go. Romans 8:29. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. What a lot of those verses are about is we have been called, we have been created, we have been made in the image of God to bear that likeness more and more and more. To be glorified, what does that mean? To actually become more like the glory, the character, the holiness of who God is. You and I are to be, another jargon word, but sanctified more and more like Christ. Let me ask you a question. What is a wonderful life? Have your thoughts about that changed over the years? What actually is a wonderful life? What is important in life? For me, more and more, it's recognizing that it's about learning to live and love like Jesus Christ. But that involves waiting because it takes time. Have you noticed how unchristlike I am? Have you noticed how unchristlike you are? But have you noticed how you also bear the image of Christ? That is to grow in you and me. And we are to wait, but not passively, go on then, God, do it to me, but actively waiting, cooperating, being open to the Spirit, the transforming Spirit of God. George is a good example of what happens when we become more Christ-like. We become more sacrificial. Think about the sacrifice of his hearing. Think about the sacrifice of being whacked round the head by the pharmacist. Think about the sacrifice of not going to college. Think about the sacrifice of giving up the honeymoon money, and sacrifice and sacrifice and sacrifice. Little acts of sacrifice show that we are becoming more like the sacrificial Christ, the beautiful sacrificial Christ. Doing things for others more, not in grand ways, but in little ways. But this is about a deep change, because many of us Christians can fake it. We can run around left, right and centre for other people. But actually, that's coming through works, that's coming through trying to be loved, that can be coming for many years. It's about a deep change by the Spirit within us. And if not, I think the same thing can happen that happened to George. All this life of being kind and sacrificial, and look what happened. He burst out in resentment in the end. He burst out in anger and resentments, which can be dangerous if we are doing all those good things in our own strength and not by the Spirit. For me, it's lifelong learning. And most of my growth, whatever growth there has been, sadly, but beautifully, it's come through being humbled. It's been through not achieving the things I thought I should be achieving. It's through the pain, it's through the struggle, it's through the suffering. and the boredom and the day-to-day stuff as well. It's a long process. We all have a shadow side, which is our lack of Christ-likeness. In the film, we have George good, Mr. Potter bad. In reality, you and I, we all have a bit of George in us and a bit of Mr. Potter in us. Who is going to win? Are you like Paul, who says, the good I long to do, I don't do, and the bad I really don't want to do, I end up doing? That tension is in all of us. We need God's help, we need God's strength to become more Christ-like. Let me draw this together. Have you noticed there's a lot of waiting involved in life? A lot of waiting involved in being a Christian, a follower of Christ. Waiting to see the impact of any good that we might do in our daily lives. It's not always obvious. A lot of waiting if and when we pray, because the results, not in a transactional way, but the difference our prayers make, it takes time to work out and see. A lot of waiting in learning to trust God, to learn that God is trustworthy. Do you think God's trustworthy? Learning that he hasn't abandoned us, that he's with us. And a lot of waiting, not passively, but to be transformed into the likeness, into the character of the one whose birth we celebrate at Christmas. Advent, waiting in the dark. Thinking about Israel waiting in a very dark place for a very long time, but the light breaking in. You and I, waiting often in our sufferings, in our struggles that the earlier part of Romans 8 talks about. The good news reflected in the film of the good news of Jesus Christ is, I believe, breakthrough often comes after breaking. If you feel like you are breaking, it's not all bad news, although it can be very painful. If down the line you feel like you're breaking, sometimes, well, let's say always, if we're open, because Scripture says God works in all things for the good of those who love him. Remembering that God hasn't abandoned you, will never abandon you. Remembering and learning that God's timing is perfect, even if he doesn't always act in the way that we would like. He will act for the best, and often through other people, and wants to act also through you more and more. Amen.